All right, good afternoon to everyone, and good afternoon to some, and good evening to others. My name is Keith Green. I am the Executive Director for Publications at the BGHRA, and also an Associate Professor of English and Africana Studies at Rutgers University in Camden. I'm excited to introduce and moderate a conversation with our panelists this afternoon or evening. In terms of format, I'll begin by introducing the panelists before they speak, and then we'll lead into questions by me, followed by comments, questions from the audience. So at any time during this panel, you can start to populate your questions using the Q&A feature of our webinar. So we'll jump right into it. Our first presentation is entitled Polishness and Blackness, an Understanding of Race in Peripheral Locations. Our presenters are Dr. Balogun, as well as Dr. Margaret Amaka Ohia-Nowak. I'll start with Dr. Balogun's biographical information first, and then lead into the next one. Dr. Balogun is a sociologist based in the Department of Geography at the University of Sheffield. He holds a prestigious Leverhulme Trust ECR Fellowship, and previously held the Leverhulme Trust Fellowship abroad at Krakow University of Economics in Poland. He serves on the editorial boards of two prestigious journals, Sociology and the Sociological Review. His research focuses broadly on colonization, race, and racialization in Central and Eastern Europe, with specific focus on Poland. Bolaji's academic publications have appeared in prestigious journals such as Ethnic and Racial Studies, the Sociological Review, and Ethnic and Migration Studies. He is currently working on a monograph entitled Race and the Color Line, the Boundaries of Europeanness in Poland, that examines an understanding of race in Poland, commissioned by Routledge and funded by the Leverhulme Trust. Dr. Margaret Amaka Ohia-Nowak is an assistant professor of language, discourse, and media studies at the Institute of Communication and Media Studies at the Marie Curie Slowacka University in Lublin, Poland. Her focus is on race and racism in public discourse in Poland, anti-Black racist discourses, and media representations of Black ethnic minorities in Poland. She is a co-author of the report on lived experiences of people of African descent in Poland. She's also a Fulbright Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley. She's a co-founder of the Alliance for Black Justice in Poland and a board member of the Association of Polish People of African Descent. She has worked extensively as a DEI trainer and consultant and a human rights activist. We welcome you both, and I'll now turn the session over to you.
Thank you very much, Capes, for such a very generous introduction. We are deeply grateful to join everybody. And also thanks to the audience, wherever you are in the part of the world, for joining us today. We're so excited to actually present this talk before you today. So what me and Margaret, what we're going to do, or what we really plan to do with this talk, is just basically two things. So I'm going to start with what you are familiar with in terms of the historical context and the narrative of race and racialization globally. And then slowly we will narrow everything gradually to the narratives of race in Central and Eastern Europe with a specific focus on Poland. And what we try to achieve in this area is just to show that, well, the notion that race is peripheral to a particular area is not entirely true, because what we see is a circulation of race and racialization globally, but with very local manifestation. So what you might think that in the US context, in the Western European context, it's not really restricted to those areas. We have the same manifestation in Central and Eastern Europe as a region that haven't been seen as a place where race doesn't exist. So To start with, let me just quickly share my screen in order to make the discussion very clear. Just bear with me. Okay, can you see my screen at the minute? Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much for that. Right. Okay, so I think a very good place to start is some sort of working definition that Margaret and I actually we're working towards, just to start thinking about, the very familiar ways in which we understand race and racism. So when we're talking about race, we're really talking about the ways in which, a particular group of people assume to share physical and cultural traits that are sort of attached to the common ancestry. This is a sort of like general understanding of race. At the same time, some sort of ideology that puts white supremacy at the heart of the colonization of the Americas and the circulation of race and racism in Europe. Also, we think about racism as a belief that races are populations that actually have physical differences. So in this way, when we start thinking about racism in this way, we start thinking about the ways in which culture is actually lumped into the notion of racism. Also, we think about practices of subordinating races, or the belief that particular race is superior over people that are actually perceived as inferior. And I think a very interesting way of starting the conversation is to sort of look at the historical context, something that some of us are already familiar with, and I think it's worth really going back to 1492. Most of the time when I speak about 1492 as some sort of historical context, I get really, really excited, because quite often we tend to overlook the production and reproduction of race. And I found it very interesting to look into this particular aspect of Columbus colonization of the Americas. When I think about 1492, I'm not talking about the voyages, not really interested in the voyages as such. I mean, if I need to think about any aspect of the voyages, will be the third voyage that Columbus made to the Americas. And there are two things that really stood out in 1492 for me that really has me to understand race globally. So it will be for that third voyage that Columbus made to the Americas. And the most importantly, while Columbus was away in the Americas doing his own colonization, ideology, spreading colonization ideology, in Spain, there was a circulation of the notion of limpieza de sangría. Many of us may be familiar with this terminology. It simply means the purity of blood. I should probably say, you've seen it on the scene, is the justification that was actually used for the exclusion of Muslims and Jews in Andalusia, Spain. So Columbus colonization of the Americas and the circulation of the notion of limpieza de sangría later became evidence in many of the other ways in which race and racism are actually produced across Europe. So as we probably will see down the line, historically, by 1735, we already have the categorization of human beings that stemmed from that notion of being pure and being impure, and also being superior, and also being seen as less superior. So for example, Carlos Linnaeus had already developed the categorization of humans when he started describing or sort of like put people in 4 different contexts, thinking about the Americas, the Asiaticos, the Africanos, and the Europeanos. And I think it's really, really interesting to pay attention to the ways in which Linnaeus described this population of people that are lumped into different categories, especially think about the way he actually described what he called an Africanus, a black, relaxed, without shame, is very crafty, is negligent, is governed by caprice. It's quite interesting. If we contrast that to the ways in which he described the Europeans, white, it's quite interesting. Muscular, inventive, governed by law, And it mentions something, very, very interesting about being, being European. As we go along, historically, we see the emergence of this categorization being, put into different places, being used, especially with the race science. The emergence of the European, Enlightenment thinkers, people like Franco Bellenius, Buffon, Blumenbach, Long, Kant, Immanuel Kant. Most people probably are aware of, the moral philosopher Immanuel Kant. Also, he wrote quite extensively about race and differences between human beings, which will later become one of the many ways in which people are actually perceived. It depends on which part of the world you're from and your appearance. And as early as 1780s, we already have the categorization of human being reduced from that 4 categories that Leonidas was talking about into now what is probably most people will lump themselves into one of these 3 areas. Either you're Caucasian, or you're Mongoloid, or you're Negroid. So this Caucasians, as probably it's being white, Mongoloid being Asiatic, and Negroid being black, and stemmed from the notion of being a Negro. And over the centuries, these ideas of categorizing people into different contexts and different, different parts really stemmed largely, across Europe and also, the Americas. But what we're actually saying today is that this categorization and definition and understanding of race is not really restrictive to these areas that we mentioned, Americas or Western Europe. We've seen the manifestation. A similar thing actually happened with countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So, for example, this is something that some of our listeners or people that actually in the audience now may not be familiar with, with Central and Eastern Europe. So I'll give you a very, very interesting, manifestation of some of these things. So, in terms of the notion of colonization of the Americas, we had a similar manifestation in Poland with the emergence of the Polish colonial society. Interestingly, probably many people don't know that Poland also tried to have, colony in Africa and in Latin America. And it's quite interesting that this, idea of having a colony wasn't just, happened. It was something that one day that the Polish statesman just thought about. It was something that actually stemmed from the broader European, Western, colonial projects that actually involved so many, people of Polish origin that really led to the attempt to also have a colony in Africa and Latin America. And the point of having a colony, again, if we think back to what Columbus was trying to do with the acquisition of wealth in the Americas, is in the same way that the Polish colonial society really attempted, as you can see in the image on the right-hand side here. The point of having a colony is to acquire wealth, to develop the metropole. So by probably 1920 to 1922, Poland already established really firmly this colonial society. They attempted to actually, purchase really large amounts of land in Africa, most especially, Angola and Liberia, in order to really, move wealth from Africa that could not be produced in Europe into Poland in order to develop, the metropole. I think this idea of trying to to move wealth from one part of the world into another part of the world was actually looked kindly upon, because they've seen that the same was actually done in the West. They believe that some of the wealth and the richness of the West and also of the Americas, they realized that many of these actually came from the colony outside Europe. Therefore, the Polish state thinkers in the 20s and the 30s, they made several attempts to have a similar thing in order to enrich their society. Also in Latin America, if you look across Brazil, Argentina, Peru, you name it, there were actually people of Polish origin in that part of the world. And these are not people that just moved to Poland. You know, these are people that have actually to Latin America. These are people that have actually been in Latin America, but they are of Polish origin. When, you know, many people make, I think they call it the forced migration, you know, to the Americas, when they purchase really large amount of land, you know, in order to actually develop the land and then enrich society at the same time, enriching the metropole. In the same sense that we have in the United States of America today, you know, I think if I'm right, outside, you know, Warsaw in Poland, probably the second, if not the third largest population of Polish people is somewhere in the Americas, or the United States of America to be precise. And these again are not recent migration. You know, these are actually migration that actually stem back from probably 1800, just thereabout. And it's really interesting to think about the ways in which also colonization works, movement of people from one location, you know, into another location in order to really encourage the movement of wealth, you know, from outside Europe into the metropole. This sense of, you know, trying to go global in the Polish context is not exactly, you know, restricted to just only attempt at colonization or attempt to have, you know, colony outside Europe. In the same sense that many of you might have heard about eugenics. So I mentioned before the 19th century race science. So this idea of the race science is often, you know, reduced to the Enlightenment thinkers, you know, Western European Enlightenment thinkers. But no, not exactly. So across Central and Eastern Europe, we have people that also, you know, that are drawn towards the same, you know, Enlightenment, you know, ideologies that are actually reproduced in Central and Eastern Europe. So, for example, eugenics. Eugenics was something that whenever we talk about eugenics, for the most part of its history, it's often reduced to, you know, to start with, the United States of America, Western Europe to be precise, Britain, and then, you know, Western Germany. Well, the notion of eugenics was not really restricted to this, you know, just few part of the world. You know, as early as 1937, Poland already had its own eugenic society. For people that can understand Polish very well, Eugenika Polska. This is about eugenics. Again, the idea of eugenics was looked kindly upon from the West and was put to use in Central and Eastern Europe, especially with the Polish Eugenic Society. And as early as 1939, Poland already had the largest number of members of Eugenic Society in the world. Now, let me try to be clear with this, what eugenics is actually doing. I mean, the notion of eugenics really, for some of us that don't really have a very clear understanding of what eugenics is doing, is to really to categorize people in terms of, you know, biological determinism. So where does this particular individual stand in terms of biology? How do they re-emerge from? And I think what eugenics is being used for in Western Europe and also in America is being used in terms of, you know, immigration, who is actually allowed to come in, who's got that kind of what might be perceived as, you know, a favorable genetics that could breed into what is seen as, you know, superior society. So in the same sense, the same eugenics was actually used in Central and Eastern Europe, to be precise, in Poland, for two reasons. And I find this very, very interesting. Eugenics did two things in the Polish case. First was the idea that, say, after the First World War, of course, you know, there are so many damages done to so many things. There are illness, there are diseases flying about. And I think eugenics was used as a way of trying to eliminate diseases, you know, stop people from spreading the diseases, which might sound reasonable. So, for example, for people to get married, they have to sort of like ask for certificates. It was probably used in terms of people that suffer with alcoholism, people that suffer with some specific context of diseases and illness. Again, that may sound welcoming. On the other hand, we need to bear in mind that after the Second World War, by 1918, Poland came to become a country again. Now, this is really where it becomes very, very interesting with the notion of eugenics, because the same eugenics that that was presented as a device of eradicating illness and diseases in the Polish lands is now being used to define who actually is Polish, who really has a Polish blood. Eugenics really is not exactly not just only looking at the skin or the body, it's really looking into the skin, looking at the blood, what is actually perceived as really original Polish blood. And this is the notion, again, I mentioned before, Limpinsa Segenria, the purity of blood. Again, it wasn't restricted to to Andalusia in Spain. The same notion was actually used as early as 1939, to define who actually belonged to the Polish states, in order for the Polish state to, assume to prosper. Again, the notion of multiculturalism was actually, excluded in that formation of the new Polish states. Hence, we have what might be perceived as, some sort of homogeneous, Polish society. So there's these two contexts of, colonization and eugenics. What really happened is they eventually play themselves out in contemporary Poland, as Margaret will show in a bit, and the ways in which some of these things are being reproduced in many interesting ways. First, in the circulation of in education, in the lived experience of people of color in the Polish society. And I think what this really tells us is just the fact that, people that actually perceive as colored, or to be precise, Black people, despite their Polish origin or despite their shared Polish origin, the notion of, being seen as, somebody who is of, say, of African background, is seen as some sort of interruption to what is assumed to be a very, very pure Polish blood. I think I will leave it there for now, and for Margaret to come in.
Thank you, Bolaji, and hello everyone. I'm sharing my screen now. To continue what Bolaji has started talking about and referring to, especially at the end of his talk. So the argument that Bolaji is presenting is actually a direct response to one of the main, I would say, aspects or dimensions of racism and constructing race in the region of CEE, Central and Eastern Europe, precisely in states like Poland, in post-communist states, that racism does not exist here. Because why that doesn't exist? Because we had no colonies, because we were not colonizers, because we did not invade, we meaning Polish people, white Polish people, from which I am excluded as a Polish Nigerian, as a Black woman being born and raised in Poland, and which I will refer to later in my talk. But the argument that Bolaji has given us today is really crucial in terms of understanding the analysis of contemporary discourses, as Bolaji mentioned, in education, so the practices of constructing, of representing, in this case, race, of actually replicating meanings that had been there for many centuries and decades before in global context as well, in terms of colonial thinking. So spreading this colonial thinking, colonial meanings, being it semantics, so in the wording, in the language, in terms of referring to people, in terms of also visual representations that I will show you in a minute, but also in terms of these discourse practices affecting the lived experience in contemporary society of Black people, of mixed race people like myself, of people of mixed heritage, of those that are perceived as non-white or non-Polish in that sense, because one actually equals another in this way of thinking. So I'd like to present, on the one hand, the discourses that developed since the era that Bolaji was talking about, so early 20th century, creating this notion of inferior Black person, of a person that is of a whiteness that's superior to Blackness, and at the same time, kind of denying that this Polish whiteness is the same thing as the Western whiteness, so-called, right? Or the global, or the US whiteness, and so on, in contemporary times now, when, for instance, still maintaining these discourses in education, in politics, of course, in anti-migration rhetorics, in media, of course, but also in academia to some extent. Also denying the importance of race being a topic for study, for research, especially in this region. And on the other hand, I would like to show how these discourses and representations are still present and continuously they evolve and revolve and fluctuate in everyday experiences of Black people that are in racialized and marginalized communities and that live in Poland. So to start with the first part, contemporary discourses that stem from the history. And the examples that I'll be giving today are mainly from children's education, from the books, and from education. So I won't be giving much of media examples. The first examples, and you can see here illustrations, so covers actually, of one of the most prominent, quote unquote, but one of the most prominent as it's perceived novel in Polish literature, entitled In Desert and Wilderness by Henryk Sienkiewicz, who was a Nobel Prize winner in 1905, but in 1999 he published this book, and this is a contradiction here because originally the book was originally published in 1911, sorry, and then the covers that you can see here are from recent times, are from 2000, so they are still there in the same form actually that you can see from illustrations, but the same story is actually being told there, the same narrative. So there is a narrative of a couple of children, of two white children traveling to Africa, to an African country, and then meeting all these, savage, inferior people, and actually colonizing and teaching them how to be civilized, and so on and so forth. So this narrative that is present, in many stories, or was present in many stories across the world. So I don't have to repeat this story again. But this story has been repeated to children, to youth, because surprisingly enough, or not maybe, this novel is still in a compulsory curriculum for the youth to read when they are around 12 and 13 years old at school. So this story is reproduced without any critical kind of ad or any critical response, even though the community, the Black community, but also the activist community and communities that are anti-racist, working with anti-racist perspective, are opposing and are also trying to establish this novel. But it's not. It's in the mainstream, right, of the curriculum, which is not surprising. But at the same time, when we look at the history and where that giving the mainstream kind of narrative that there is no racism in Poland, or there was nothing like colonialism in the past, which is of course not true. Then it's actually a proof that this colonial thinking was present for in the history of even before the First World War ended, like Bolaji said, when the state was reconstructed again. After the over 100 years of being dependent of other countries. And the second example is a comic book written in the 30s, 20th century, and as you can see here, still being reproduced in a very similar form in terms of visual representation here of a Black person, but also what you will see in a second from the lived experiences, and also coming back to the categorization of human beings, on subspecies and so on. So these biological races, a lot of references or lots of kind of metaphors here. You can see visual metaphors comparing a Black person to an animal, actually, and showing a Black person, or only in this kind of savage and jungle, quote unquote, uncivilized form, blackface, and all these horrible representations that you can see here. And the title of the comic book is The Rose and Pranks of the Little Monkey Ficky Mickey. So it will suggest that the monkey is actually the main character, but at the same time, it kind of brings this brings this associations with animalistic dehumanization, as some psychologists call it. So this this reference to a Black person not being a real human, and it also is represented on linguistic level with the naming and the usage of the name of the Black person here, that is onomatopoeistic. Sorry, I have to say a very linguistic word here, but the name of this Black character here is Goga Goga. So, which is obviously also dehumanizing, basically. And the last examples from the education, that is, I would say, the most controversial in the Polish context nowadays, and is still being discussed and, still being kind of argued, that this innocent poem about a Black boy, about a Black second-hand word boy, bamboo, is okay to be taught at schools, in the kindergartens, and so on. It's a poem that actually has a lot of colonial semantic meanings, like the soaping, the whole soaping narrative, the washing of the dark skin by soap, referring to what Stuart Hall was also talking about a lot, and all these advertisements that you may also have in mind that were presenting a Black person as being a dirty person, right? So the black skin, the black body is something that's dirty, that needs to be washed, and it can't be washed really unless you're white. When you're white, then you're clean and you're pure. And this will also refer, indirectly to eugenics that Bolaji was talking about. There are also other meanings here that are hidden in this very kind of, I would say, on the surface, there is nothing offensive in this poem, but at the same time, there is a lot of harmful content. You can already see it from the illustrations here, so I don't think I have to explain more. Fast forward to 2021, so last year, when this poem was also performed as a performance by school teachers, and also as an activist, I also was part of the big debate whether this, you know, and just talking to people that were absolutely convinced that the poem is doing nothing wrong other than just bringing this cultures, but what cultures, right? Of course. So lack of understanding. And as I said, the second part of my presentation will give you some context from the research that I was part in, the study that's called Polish Prejudice Survey, that is a forthcoming report, a study that is actually a periodic study. So every 4 years, the Center for Research on Prejudice at the University of Warsaw in Poland issues a report or a monograph, a book on the prejudices of Polish people against so-called out groups. It's more of a social psychology context here. So I was part of the study that was responsible for studying the prejudices against Black people in Poland, of white people against Black people in Poland. And I have conducted a series of interviews based on which I wrote a chapter, but I also wanted to show you some results from the quotes from respondents that were parts of the whole study, and also some conclusions and categories. So I mentioned before animalistic dehumanization that is manifested in discourses, that's manifested in media discourses as well, in discourses, in everyday thinking. And we have this quote from Emma here that says that she's been compared to a monkey. They've been compared to a monkey. Sorry for this misgendering. They've been compared to a monkey to the wilderness, that I come from the wilderness, that I have no culture at all, that I was never in contact with the civilization of the 21st century, that I would ride an elephant to get to school. End of quote. So this clearly shows that, and there were lots of quotes like these, the monkey, banana, eating banana. So being an animal, riding animals and just living also in bushes. This would be these meanings. The second one would be aggressive sexuality, that is also related to this animalistic metaphors. So the metaphors, when I say metaphors, it's just used to be to embody the content here. So metaphors help us actually kind of understand the word more, right? To just make it more simple. And people make comparisons very quickly to the meanings that they have learned from school, that they have learned from other discourses. So in this case, there will be discourses, there will be this metaphors, animal metaphors, but also sexual metaphors that would refer both to men and to female on the gender aspect. But this quote, comparisons to some monkey, bamboos, asphalt, and so on, these kinds of statements, but the kind of statements that aren't actually directly aimed at me are the kind of statements that just attribute various kinds of traits to me, such as excessive sexual excitability of some kind, or some kind of aggressive tendencies, or that kind of behavior. The third category is or the third, I would say, yeah, conclusion or the pattern, better said, all Black people look the same. So again, kind of nothing new to those both that study it and those that experience it as well. So that we would be perceived, and I say we because I'm also part of the community as a researcher and a scholar, but also part of the community. So we would be compared to other Black people, to famous people, for instance, that will not look like us at all. So people would perceive us just like stereotypical characters from the movies, or you look like her, or you are sisters or something like that. So I can completely identify myself here in these lived experiences as well. And another one would be putting a Black person in a box of the other, so the othering, right? A very general pattern, very general way of excluding the members of community. So there is a story here that I want to refer to of Sister Emma, and she shared the story that she wanted to rent an apartment, and as soon as the agent in the apartment realized that she was not white, the agent called the owner and said, oh, that's okay, she wants to rent this apartment, but there is one thing, there is one problem, that she's not from Poland, or maybe she has a different background than Polish background, even though the Emma was holding her ID card that states that she is Polish, and in fact she is Polish. There was still this problem of her being of different origin, and this also brings us to a different, problem of again denying systemic racism, saying that it wasn't about race and things like that. It was about actually a passport. In this case, there is a very clear argument here that it was about her skin color, actually, even though the skin color was not referred to, or put it broadly, race was not referred to. The last sentence here, she had to point out that I'm not flesh and blood Polish, but half Polish, or maybe that I have a different skin color. And of course, and this is not an exclude, it's not like an isolated experience. There are many like these in the Polish context also, when it comes to being a refugee, a Black refugee, in the context of the war in Ukraine, that I'm also involved in helping brothers and sisters and people that went through double trauma in the war of Ukraine. And the last but not least, Black is not Polish. That's again, that kind of comes back to what Bolaji asked before, who really is Polish, right? So the question is, who is really Polish in context of eugenics? Most often, white Polish people would not think that we understand Polish. And the quote here also shows this pattern. So in some situation, when I answer them or argue with them, they are usually very shocked because they don't expect me to speak Polish. And the last slide will show you the number of microaggressions that also microaggressions, so this kind of subtle, innocent forms of exclusion, but for many, and especially for those that experience these racial microaggressions, they are not subtle, they are not innocent, and so on, but they would actually impact lived experience and impact our lives to a biggest extent. So those most frequent ones would be insistent staring on the street, so people feeling like an animal in a zoo or a trophy in a museum, right? So it also is exotization. And again, touching her, can I touch your hair, with asking without permission. So these racial microaggressions that also are present to many, and that they are experienced by many communities of color around the globe, they also happen in Poland. And finally, other questions like, where are you really from? Do you get tanned? Do you eat bananas? Why do you speak Polish so well? This is my favorite because this is what I experience quite a lot in academia as well. Being a Polish linguist and raised in Poland, speaking Polish. But I know this is also experience of many African Europeans, many Black Dutch people, Black people in the world, but also people of in marginalized, racialized communities in other countries too. And of course, this physical distancing, racial profiling, physical aggressions on many levels, but also on these micro everyday levels. So they are stinging and also, again, impacting the lived experiences. And then coming back to the beginning of the presentation, so the discourses, and coming back to Bolaji's presentation, one actually fuels another, right? So these microaggressions will fuel institutionalized practices, and we will fuel the thinking and creating and shaping mindsets, beliefs, opinions, and discourses. So we are coming back again like a vicious cycle. And I'm inviting you, Bolaji, to give us some conclusions.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thanks very much, Margaret. So what Margaret and myself have been actually saying is actually three major conclusions. I mean, there are several conclusions we could draw from this, and I suppose all of you can draw your own conclusion as well from what you've seen from the historical context, from the images that Margaret actually shared with us. But one really key major, conclusions or brief conclusions that we thought we could come up with, at least just to really open up the discussion generally, is to think about race in a very unknown or unrecognized or understudied locations. And in thinking in that line, well, we're thinking about the broader European imperial powers, and it's basically the ways in which they've made this notion of, being European powerful things. You see what we call the second-tier European powers, like the Polish states, like the Czech states, like the Hungarian states, using the same, well-circulated European imperial power, to describe or to, eliminate people that actually perceive as non-European, or at least people that really don't, belong to that region. The second thing to also think about is the notion of coloniality in the Polish context. This is really loaded terminology that's not really been fully explored in Poland. When we look really closely at this notion of coloniality, we find that it really stemmed from the whole early conceptualization of race and the categorization of people that are structured around those things that I started talking about in the first place, going back to 1492. And lastly, being seen as, as Black is quite interesting in the Polish context. It will be a non-hygienic type of body, because when you had, I mean, Margaret mentioned before, who is a Polish person? I remember speaking to somebody in one of my interviews when I was in Poland to describe, how will you describe a Polish person? And this person said to me, people will describe a Polish person as a white person, and that's it. So a white person is really perceived as the Polish person. So it doesn't matter whether you are born, whether you've lived all your life in Poland, as far as you are of something that looks like, or something that is interrupted a Polish origin, then you are perceived as somebody who is not, originally, belonging to that part of the world. And that is what that's what eugenics does. The point of eugenics is really to identify who belongs and who doesn't belong through the notion of biological determinism. And I think for us, this is the most dangerous idea that quite a lot of people in the Polish society, and frankly, largely in the West and probably in the US, we don't really have a very good understanding of. But we'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both of our first presenters. You've given us a lot to think about. I want to transition to our next presenter. Her talk is titled "The Complexity of Liberty: Black Liberators in the Dutch province of Brabant in 1944," and that's by Jasmijn Janssen. Jasmijn finished a bachelor's degree in American Studies at Radboud University and continued her studies at this university with a research master's in historical, literary, and cultural sources. She also works as a student assistant for several research projects, such as the historical database of Suriname, Curaçao, and Native American soldiers in the Netherlands in World War II. She's been documenting African-American soldiers who liberated the Netherlands at the end of World War II for several years and will present her latest findings during her presentation. Her two main research interests are American soldiers from different ethnic groups who fought in World War II and slavery in the former Dutch colonies. Lastly, she is editor-in-chief of Extempore, the official scholarly journal of the history department of Radboud University. Jasmine, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I will also share my screen. I hope it's visible now for everyone. Yes? Okay, great. So thank you very much for this opportunity as still a graduate student to present here. I would like to talk to you about a subject that has fascinated me for several years now, and all of its complexity, and of course it is also a forgotten part of the history of World War II, which is very much a huge topic, I think, in the United States and in Europe as well, but this part of it is very much still unknown. So how did I get to do this research on this specific Dutch province? Well, I did my internship. Well, it doesn't move, does it? Oh, it does. Yes, it can move to the next slide. Great. I did my internship at an organization called Erfgoed Brabant in Dutch, which I freely translate as Heritage of Brabant. They are a non-profit organization which works with all kinds of local and national heritage organizations that do something with the history of that province. So the Netherlands consists of 12 provinces, not very much actually like American states. It's just like several areas. And they have a very large project titled Brabant Herinnert, or Brabant Remembers, and it's about remembering the Second World War, and what they want to invest in is to collect new stories, do new research into forgotten stories. And I pitched my research to them, and I pitched my research to Radboud University, and both said, yeah, this is a forgotten story that needs to be researched, so you get a 5-month internship to do it. Other parties that have been involved in my internship are Liberators.nl. If you want to know more about Black American soldiers in the Netherlands, please visit the website. I'm also a volunteer for that organization. If you're interested, it's also just some stories about it. And North American soldiers in the Netherlands, which is another project in which I'm involved. And Mathilde Rosa, who is the professor leading this project, also led my internship. She's not specialized in African American soldiers, as no one is in the Netherlands. There's no professors, but she is specialized in Native American soldiers, so she could help me with the soldier aspect of it and the minority aspect, but from a different angle. So what did I research? I researched Native Americans and African Americans in my internship, but I will focus on African American soldiers in this presentation, as this fits the content better for this audience. And I focused on the liberation of this specific province. So as some of you may know, the Netherlands was liberated at the end of World War II in 2 phases. So you have a lot of large rivers in the Netherlands which split the country in a northern and a southern part. Operation Market Garden was launched to liberate all of the Netherlands, but it only partially succeeded. So only the south of the Netherlands was liberated. And Brabant is in the south of the Netherlands. So it was in the part of the Netherlands that was liberated more early. In 1944 instead of 1945. Because of the fact that that Black soldiers as a group of liberators in the Netherlands is very much unknown, I did not only want to have a scholarly article as output, which is currently under review, but I also wrote 3 articles, 2 about African American soldiers, for the general public in Dutch, so that also people who are not professional historians can easily access my research. And I first focused very much on finding personal life stories, not only because that's what I wanted, but also because I contacted all major archives in the province, and they all came back to me with, I don't think we have anything in our archive about Black soldiers, which definitely triggered me. And it triggered them too, to start thinking, why don't we have anything? But that's why I also focused more on oral history and on local amateur historians, as well as amateur historians from the United States. So about African-American soldiers in the Netherlands, what do we already know? What do I already know from previous research I've done over the past years, and from the Black Liberators Foundation? The estimation is that about 15,000 soldiers of color were in the Netherlands during some time in the war. So this can be for a shorter or longer period. And that most of them were in the southern provinces, so below the big rivers, because of the failure of Operation Market Garden. So they were kind of stuck in the southern part of the Netherlands for several months. The US Army couldn't move forward. So most of them were in the fall and winter of 1944, so from September to December 1944. After that, most Black troops were moved on to Belgium to fight in the Battle of the Bulge, so the offensive for the liberation of the Ardennes area. Also, I don't know how much is known about this for you, but the American Army was segregated along the color line very strictly. I think for Americans this might be very obvious, but I'm just telling it anyway. So Black American soldiers were not allowed to serve in combat units. They could only serve in service units, so units that did not fight. Many of them became truck drivers, so they transported goods from the harbors of Normandy and later from Antwerp to the front lines. This was also a very dangerous job. So often this prejudice is that then it was less dangerous because they didn't fight. This is definitely not true. It was also very harsh in terms of conditions, as they drove sometimes for 20 hours a day. I see often when I look at the deaths of Black soldiers, especially towards the end of the war, more of them die of car accidents because of the exhaustion that they faced. The general consensus is that not only in the Netherlands, but throughout most of Western Europe, Black soldiers were received with open arms. Remember, they are the liberators. But there is also very much hints of exoticism and paternalistic attitudes in their reception and the way they are represented in newspaper articles or in photographs or in oral history. So this is this paradox that you see. So people were very happy to have them. They were the liberators. On the other hand, they also had their prejudices that came from culture and from their knowledge of colonies and from children's books. So that also worked in their reception of Black soldiers. So some of the previous research, well, for Europe, most of the research that has been done is very much about Britain and Germany. For example, for Britain, there's this publication of Lucy Bland, Britain's Bound Babies. I think she has presented at a conference here before. And for Germany, there's even more publications. For instance, Fernbach's Race After Hitler. Most of the publications are focused on the children of white European mothers and Black soldiers. So is the only Dutch publication. It's by Mieke Kerkels. This is the translation of it, who recently came out 2020. And she also interviewed children of African-American soldiers and Dutch mothers. And she focused mainly on Limburg, which is a different province in the Netherlands, even like next to Brabant, I would say. So, of course, like many soldiers in World War II, also African-American soldiers had children with women from the countries they liberated. And these works focus on how these children fared in European society. My work here will focus more on how the soldiers themselves experienced it and how the Dutch people experienced meeting the soldiers. I will explain to you why I didn't focus on the liberation children later. So I have two case studies for you. One case study is from the Dutch perspective. It's by Wim. He's a Dutch person from the province I study. But I also very much wanted to add the African-American perspective here. And that is the perspective of Private First Class Donald H. Brown. So I was very lucky to get in touch with his grandson and daughter. So first, the case study of Wim and his family. You can see Wim here in the middle of the picture with the gun in front of his face. That's Wim. He was 12 when his village Handel, which is a really tiny village in Brabant, was liberated. And he is on the pictures, on the picture where he is himself with the gun. There are his three African-American friends who are called Lane, Dave, and Douglas. He doesn't remember their last names anymore. And the girls on the picture are his sisters. The other picture is of the entire family. You don't see Wim there because he took the picture. And these soldiers became friends of the entire family. So they wanted to have something to remember that after the war. So they took pictures together. They don't remember, and they're not sure anymore if the African-American soldiers also had copies of the pictures, which is really hard to trace for me because I don't have any last names. And Lane, Douglas, and Dave, there are so many people in America who are called that. So, about the to paint the picture. So Handel is this very tiny village in Brabant. Brabant is very much, especially in the 1940s, a rural province. A lot of farmers live there. It's very much, the villages are very close-knit societies still today, but especially in the 1940s. And people had never seen a Black person. The vast majority of people in those villages had never seen a Black person. They had heard of Black people through, for example, Catholic missionaries who spoke about the missionary work they did in Africa in church. They had also usually learned about the colonies of the Netherlands in school, so about Suriname and the colonies in the West Indies, about Indonesia. So they had this artificial image of the Black person or the other in their head from what they've learned, but they had never actually had contact with a Black person. And then at once there is the end of a war, which was already a very life-changing period for most of the Dutch people. And then they are liberated, and the liberators don't look like what they expected them to look like. Most people didn't know there were African-American soldiers in the American army. So when the liberation comes and this village was liberated by British and African-American troops, some people criticize me for saying that because they say that, yes, but the African-American soldiers didn't fight. They come after the liberation. And then I always say, like, liberation is much more than just a fight. The fight wasn't possible without ammunition, without food, etc. So yes, they did definitely liberate this village. So yeah, then they are surprised. So I interviewed Wim. Wim is still alive today. Wim is just turned 90. And I talked to him about what was it like for you to have these soldiers not only liberate your village, but then also have them billeted into your farm. So they hosted 20 soldiers, and to get to know them and to live with them for several months. So I asked Wim about several things, but I want to show you two main parts of it. And I also asked him about the reception of the soldiers. He told me, as far as I know, every soldier was welcome in every home. He doesn't remember any Dutch families saying, well, I don't want Black soldiers. Many of the farms took in African-American soldiers. I went into the local archive and I found documents for all the families that took in soldiers during that period. And basically that was almost every farm in the village. So what Wim says is confirmed by the archival documents. He also tells me that he now knows what discrimination is, but that the concept was completely new to him. So what he means here is not that there was no discrimination in the Netherlands, but that they didn't know about it. Like African-American soldiers knew about it. You know, they lived in a segregated society. That this was completely new to him, especially as a 12-year-old. This was also a difficult concept, I think, as a 12-year-old. And what is unique for this case study is that British and African-American soldiers were billeted in homes together. So the American army was very, very strictly segregated. So if these were white American soldiers, this would have never happened. But since they were British, the British were like, yeah, I'm fine. They didn't come from a segregated society. Wim does not remember any fights between the British and African-American soldiers. He does remember that they slept together, cooked together, did everything together, which is very unique, I think. Also because for the British soldiers, meeting African-Americans might also have been very new. But you must keep in mind that this is the liberation period is also a period of chaos and of joy, but also danger. So this is very, very much a different situation than meeting a Black person on the street, for instance. Wim does remember that he heard that the Black soldiers the Black unit was attached to a British unit because the racism of the white American soldiers was so fierce towards them. And I actually tried to look into this, and I looked at the archival documents of the unit, of another unit in Brabant, and they were also attached to British units. So this happened more often. So this could actually be to protect them from the fierce racism from their white American peers. I don't have hard proof for it. I can only prove that it happened for more units, so that this was a structural thing to attach Black American units to British units. I also talked to him about romantic relationships between Black soldiers and girls from the village. And he said, yeah, well, that definitely happened, and it happened a lot. That's the short story. You must remember he was 12, but he remembered that there were a lot of little balloons around the trucks. So the African-American soldiers that were billeted into his farm were truck drivers. So they parked their trucks in front of the farm, and then they went inside to the farm. And he remembers there were a lot of little balloons around the trucks, but his mom told him, no, don't play with them. He also accidentally, he was really ashamed to tell me this, but I think it's this very wonderful example of his, him experiencing this as a child. He also told that he was looking for Lane. Lane was one of the soldiers that he was one of his best friends, and he thought, let's look in his truck. And then he found him there with a girl, and he ran away because he was just old enough to know what that meant. And So this happened, but it was not just fun and games. Wim also remembers that the girls who had relationships with black soldiers were called schoenpoetsdeusjes. This is Dutch dialect. I translated as shoe polish girls, and it refers to if you are with a black person that this will stain, that they stain your skin with black soot or shoe polish in this case. It is very much a narrative that comes from the Dutch Black Pete idea that also has soot on his face. And in this case, it's then shoe polish, but it's about, the black stains being left by a black person. Wim also says, I was 12 at the time, but I see this definitely as racism and discrimination now as an adult. He does add, and I think that is an important contextualization, that the girls who were black soldiers were not bullied or frowned upon, and the girls who were with German soldiers were definitely bullied and frowned upon and shamed for that for years and years to come. However, so there's this, it's this hierarchy, I think, it's best to be with a white American soldier, then it's better to be with a black American soldier, but it's even worse to be with a German soldier, That I think that this was the hierarchy that was put in place. I also tried to find out if there are Black liberation children in this village, and there are. There are 2 Black liberation children in this village. One has passed away, and the other is still there. For the person who passed away, I spoke to his family members, and for the person who is still there, I spoke to him personally. And their names are not in this presentation because they didn't want them to be there. They want to help me with my research, but they didn't want to be named because they said we were always very much liked in the community, but we could never talk about the fact that we were Black. We could never ask who was our father. Both have no idea who their father is. So they were, they were part of this community, but they were, there were also a taboo. Their skin color is a taboo. Even today, it's too much of a taboo for them to speak out about it in public, to be named by researchers. So I think that is very telling for, how their life was and how this paradox works. So they were liked. They could play football with boys. They all of that, but they were not, as long as they wouldn't stress that they were Black, and as long as they wouldn't look for their fathers or ask for their fathers. So it's a very complex dynamic here. To move on to a different case study. So I have a case study. I figured out that there were 2 units in these 2 neighboring villages in another part of Brabant. So I started looking for their archival records, and I got in touch with a local American division historian. So they're part of this large 7th Armored Division, and fortunately there's very fanatic amateur historian working on this division. And I asked him, do you ever get in touch with any of the families of African-American soldiers? Because he knew a lot about it. He helped me to get documents. And I said, did any family of African-American soldiers ever reach out to you? He said, yes, they did. I was like, yes, finally, because it's not that easy to get to them from overseas. So I got contacts, and this family was actually very eager to help me, and I was very eager to help them know more about their father and grandfather. So I'm very honored to be able to tell the story of Private First Class Donovan Brown. As you can see, he did not survive the war. He died at the end of the war in a truck accident, like many of his peers, at age 23, which is even younger than I am. So that's really a weird thing to realize. But we can tell his or I can tell his story with the help of his daughter and his grandson. And I also found his death documents. His family also never saw those before, so they didn't really know where he died, how he died. So we found out together. Here is part of his story told through the eyes of Lowell Terrell, his grandson. He said to me, if I asked him, why did your father join the army? Or your grandfather, I'm sorry. He said to me, my grandfather really enjoyed driving trucks. And so he volunteered to enlist in the army. A lot of Black men volunteered. And he had several reasons. He wanted to see the world. He was 19 when he volunteered, but also his reason was to support his family. Going into the army meant a standard wage. A wage that's probably higher than what he was making in a normal job, and he wanted to support his family. When he left, he had just married, and his wife was pregnant, so he wanted to do that. He did definitely support his family. Not only does his family say that he wrote a lot of letters and he sent money back, but when I look at his death documents, I found that on his body, in his clothes, they found 5 used money order receipts. So on the day he died, he had recently sent 5 money order receipts to his family to financially support them. So that was definitely confirmed by his death documents. On the picture, you see the Terrell family. They made a wonderful picture for me. I'm so thankful. They're holding the flags. The woman in the blue sweater is Janet Terrell, his daughter, who never knew her father, of course, because he never was able to return to see her. And she's holding an encased flag, so the flag that was laid over the coffin of her father. But as you can see, there are her grandchildren and great-grandchildren holding the flags of her husband and her daughter, who both also joined the army, as well as Lowell Terrell, who spoke to me. I think this family has served more than a lifetime in the army. And they said that their grandfather's decision to serve in the army and to liberate Europe in World War II actually affected their choice to serve in the army. So if you talk about intergenerational effects, this definitely is there. Apologies. When I started talking to the Terrell family, they were actually very surprised that I was interested in their story. And I asked them, like, did anyone ever ask about your grandfather? And they said, no, especially not a white person. And so Lowell told me, I think this is a quote who summarizes it all. He says, I find it rather interesting that history of the World War never spoke about soldiers of color. I feel they played a major role in fighting for the democracy of people back then and still today. So he very much stresses that the fight for democracy for all that his grandfather fought for and he fought for is not over yet. So this is the impact that it has on the other side of the ocean. So it had an impact on them on the Dutch side, but also had very much an impact on the other side of the ocean. So to conclude, I hope my research can contribute a little bit to a more inclusive historiography of World War II. I hope that my research can also connect the local and the transatlantic, and that they are not mutually exclusive, so that a local story can also be a transatlantic story and vice versa. I hope also that it contributes to understanding of Dutch interracial contact. Very much of the racism research in the Netherlands and Black studies in the Netherlands is very much focused on the Randstad areas, that's the area surrounding Amsterdam, and the reception of Surinamese and Antillean immigrants in the Netherlands. And that is great, but there's also other Black people who live in the Netherlands or who have been in the Netherlands throughout history. So I hope we can diversify that narrative and see also where how there is a difference in the way that people dealt with Surinamese immigrants than the way that people dealt with Black liberators. Why? Because there's very much a different dynamic going on there. I hope that my research can also bring somewhat of a recognition for these forgotten liberators. That's why I also focus so much on these personal stories. A lot of Dutch people do not even know that there were Black soldiers who liberated their country. I think it is very important that we realize that our freedom came to be by an army that was segregated in white and Black, and was also, that there were people fighting for our freedom, for my freedom, that were not free themselves and who gave their lives, even though they were not free themselves, to save my country from a racist regime. So that is very interesting, I think, and very powerful as well. So yeah, I hope that the powerful war narratives can also inspire us today to look at race differently, and to see that interracial contact can be different in some cases. Well, that was my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much to all our presenters. Really rich conversations in terms of how your presentation are speaking to each other. And so I have a couple questions, but I also want to give space to a couple of questions that we have in the Q&A. So I'll start with Balaji first, and we'll just kind of move through to allow time for each of the presenters to at least have time for one response. You talked a bit about the kind of history of race, which I loved how you foregrounded that, we think about Columbus in terms of the voyages, but also what you're also saying is that the kind of articulation of race, right, kind of has some roots here, but also this idea of purity and kind of how that's essential to our sense of what race might mean. And so I wondered if you kind of speak to the question of what does Blackness mean in that context? Because for lots of folks, Blackness becomes not as simply a trait or an ideology, it becomes a kind of sense of, historical connectedness, same cultural past, but then the other sense of race that you're mentioning here is also coextensive, right, with that idea, this idea that kind of racial categorization is always and already tied up in eugenics and tied up in this kind of classification. So maybe you could speak to kind of how you reconcile, how do we celebrate Blackness as we're doing here in this conference and in our work, but also reconcile it with the history of kind of racial construction, which is ultimately a bankrupt one.
Thanks very much for that question, Keith. Well, it's a very, very loaded question to start with. Where on the one hand, as you said, there's quite a lot of historical context to the understanding of Blackness and understanding of race and the circulation of race and racism. And I think there are two things we need to do when it comes to this reconciliation. First, we need to have a very good, understanding and good awareness of this historical context, because part of the problems we are having, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, is the lack of this, historical context, getting into the public domain to actually understand that some of the things that we're witnessing now in Poland, they stem from the West. Because for a very long time, we really, even in the most complex, the most comprehensive historical books, in Central and Eastern Europe, there's been really this notion that that part of the world is very isolated, it's never had really big contact with the part of the world, therefore it's post-racial. So it's lack of this understanding that's really causing so many problems for so many people. So for example, if for a very long time this recognition has been there, and the emerging people of color in that community, well, in that part of the world, perhaps they will have reckoned with it and they will have been able to know how to celebrate their own identity as well as their Polish identity together. So to reconcile or to celebrate Blackness, as you asked, is first of all to reckon with the past, but not to live in the past, because to live in the past is for me, is to be crumbled. So you need to look forward, you need to look at the society, you need to understand, the ways in which your society is actually structured, and at the same time, take on some of the really emerging understanding of the way individuals are actually perceiving a particular, space. So, of course, celebration it's really, really important. It's very important to hang on the progress that, the Black identity will be able to actually thrive in many society. I mean, US is always the gold standard in terms of the celebration of Blackness, not even, here in Britain. So yeah, it's quite remarkable the way, Black Americans, African Americans have actually done in the US. But at the same time, we need to reckon with the fact that without creating, a space like this for the expression of, Black identity and Black studies and Black understanding, space for Black people to actually experiment and, have discussions about, their identity. It's one thing to have a discussion. In that process, we are also one way or the other celebrating, the Blackness. In another form. And I think in the US, you take it to a different level, to be specific. So, which is quite, again, this is why quite a lot of country in the world, they sort of like try to emulate the US context, which has its own good and bad. So yeah, that reckoning with history for me, it's really, really crucial, especially in the part of the world that I'm looking at. I mean, Jasmijn, spoke neatly about this, that, people in the Netherlands, the white people in the Netherlands, they often thought about the fact that they were liberated by, their white peers without thinking about, liberation as a very complex, very complicated, very, very ambiguous, concept that also involved people from, the other part of the world. And in that context, if we can have this kind of historical context, established in the mainframe, being discussed openly, I think that will be part of the process of actually moving the Blackness forward. I'll keep it short for now.
Well, thank you so much for that. So for Margaret, we have actually two questions in the Q&A, and so one can go to Margaret and the other can go to Jasmijn. So this is from John Davis. I've lived in Germany since 2022. I'm surprised at the level of racism here. I've traveled to 21 EU countries, including Poland. I've also been surprised. How do you align your effort for change with other EU-wide efforts for change, thinking through kind of the contemporary moment, which I think part of your work was really explaining?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's a great question. I think I will answer from a different level than my presentation was, but rather from the work that I'm doing on the field, so-called on the field. So as an activist, as Alliance for Black Justice in Poland, and also other organizations that I'm working with here in Poland, we are trying to partner as much as we can to network with EU organizations, with communities on that level. But it's not easy. I mean, Bolaji said that, we are perceived as an isolated, or we had been perceived as an isolated country or region, but we, in fact, as a community, as an African Polish community, as a Black community in Poland, we are isolated, and we live in a form of isolation, not only between Poland and other countries, or so-called Western EU countries, but also within each other. So our efforts right now are more to actually get the community together and try to, I don't want to say mobilize, because it's not only about fighting or resisting and so on. It's also about celebrating, as your question, Keith, was before. It's actually about also just celebrating ourselves, about preventing burnout in this work, about looking at racial trauma that we have gone through as well. So I would say, first of all, right now it's more about aligning our efforts within the country, within the region here, and then the other dimension is, partnering, for instance, with ENAR, European Network for Anti-Racism, but also with other organizations that work towards change. So yeah, that would be my brief response.
No, thank you so much for that. I think that's right on point as well. And so just the last question, as we're up against the clock, is for Jasmine. It's really about a question of the archives and methodology. And so you kind of talked a little bit about this, and maybe you could just kind of give some closing comments on kind of working with the sources that you have to deal with, going to the archives, not having a specialist there who kind of was working in what you're looking for, not having the actual records and having to go to oral sources. And of course, the complication with having people who pass away and then having the stories actually, go along with them. So maybe you could speak to that.
Yes. Yeah, well, I think archives are very, the archives that I spoke to were very much helpful. They really wanted to help, but they simply don't have any sources on African-American soldiers in their collections. But they did want to help to get me to people who might have sources. So it is definitely not that they don't want to. It's just that, history didn't record this part of history. If you're asking about people from Indonesia, right? Oh, West Indians, sorry. No, that's people from the Antilles and Suriname. Yes, I think the same is largely true for that group of people. I'm actually in the research project, the historical database of Suriname, Curacao, and I'm currently working on other research for Curacao. And the problem, I think, with the West Indies, the complication of it is that some records are in the Netherlands and some records are on the Antille Islands or in Suriname. For my research, I have to go to Curacao to get access to the actual documents that I need. Again, there I have the same experience. The people in the archives are really helpful, even if they're not specialists. They really want to help you to see the value of this research very much. But it is a question of who writes history, I think. So for the West Indies, if you want to look at the history of enslaved people, they left very few sources. So all the sources we have about them, even if they were, if they are still in the archives, are not written by them. They are written by their owners or written by their colonizers. So, it's always this lens that you have. You look through this colonial lens at a group that didn't have a voice, and how are you going to find their voice somewhere in that source material? If you want to do research into it, I would say just do it, because it's very rewarding, but it's not easy. It is not, it's definitely much harder than looking into a group who is well documented. And also I would recommend you, especially, I don't know, but I felt the urge as a white researcher to incorporate African-American voices in my research as much as I could, because I can never tell it from a perspective that is not mine. I can only listen to their perspective and hope to reiterate it correctly here. So yeah, that's basically my answer.
But thank you so much for that. I think it's a really great point. And I would also say, I think this is echoed by someone in the chat as well, that we look at people like scholars like Marissa Fuentes, Sadia Hartman. They've also been really phenomenal in terms of how they've used those archives, which are often not only simply not forthcoming, but are actually opposed to Black life, right? Opposed to kind of elucidating and illuminating kind of Black experience and using those official narratives, which are often directed towards white interests and white gazes, to actually kind of tell the stories of people of color in really kind of dynamic ways. So I think that does require a certain type of position and expertise, but certainly we have models out there with folks like Hartman, like Fuentes, in terms of how to take the archive and make it say things which it did not intend to do. But thank you all, three of you, for fascinating presentations. We really could talk for another hour or so, but I want to make sure that we respect the other panels which are coming up very shortly in keynotes. So thank you all again. It's been a fantastic conversation, and looking forward to the rest of the talks for the rest of the day. All right.